November 14th, 1978, 2:47 a.m. Apartment 4B, 1650, Wisconsin Avenue, Nauru, Washington, D.C. The smell hit Detective Michael Cordderero the moment the building super cracked open the door. Not the sulfuric reek of natural gas. That would have been standard, almost comforting in its familiarity. This was something else, something organic and wrong, like rotting eggs mixed with burnt rubber. The November cold made the odor heavier, clinging to the air in the narrow hallway outside the apartment, where Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman had called in a suspected gas leak 40 minutes earlier. Cordderero, 32, 14 months with the Metropolitan Police Department's Emergency Response Unit, pulled his flashlight from his belt. The building super, a nervous Filipino man named Carlos Reyes, stayed in the doorway, one hand covering his mouth and nose. Inside the apartment, darkness. Complete darkness, which struck Cordderero as odd. If someone had smelled gas, why hadn't they turned on lights? Then he remembered. Protocol. Gas and electricity don't mix. Mrs. Hoffman, Cordderero called into the apartment. MPD, we're here about the leak. No response. Just the smell, getting stronger now, and something else. A faint mechanical hum, barely audible, coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment. Not a refrigerator. Not heating. Something else. The brownstone, built in 1924, had been converted into 6 apartments in the early 60s. Wisconsin Avenue was quiet at this hour, the streetlights casting orange pools on the wet pavement outside. A light rain had started, tapping against the windows with irregular rhythm. Cordderero stepped inside, sweeping his flashlight across a living room that looked like it belonged in a museum of middle-class American life. Floral print sofa, console television, stack of Reader's Digest magazines on a coffee table. Everything precisely arranged, almost sterile. On the wall, a framed photograph of a young couple, the woman blonde, the man dark-haired, both smiling stiffly in front of the Jefferson Memorial. No dust on the frame. No dust anywhere, actually. The hum was louder now, coming from a door at the end of a short hallway. Corddero's instincts, honed by 2 tours in Vietnam before he'd joined the force, told him something was very wrong. The smell wasn't gas. The apartment was too clean, too arranged. And that hum, that definitely wasn't residential. Mrs. Hoffman, he called again, louder this time. The door at the end of the hallway stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, Cordderero could see a thin line of red light, the kind that came from darkroom equipment or electronic displays. His hand moved instinctively to his service weapon, a Smith & Wesson Model 10, though he didn't draw it. Not yet. The mechanical hum pulsed now, regular as a heartbeat, and beneath it Cordderero detected another sound, paper feeding through a machine, the distinctive click-whir of automated printing. He pushed the door open with his foot. What he saw in that moment would trigger the largest counterintelligence investigation on American soil since the Rosenberg case, expose a spy network that had been operating undetected for 17 years, and accidentally reveal the existence of a CIA operation so classified that only 11 people in the entire United States government knew it existed. But first, he had to deal with the smell. The official story, as it appeared in the Washington Post 3 days later, was straightforward enough. Elderly woman reports gas leak. Police discover illegal printing operation. Suspect flees. The article ran on page B7, a mere 6 paragraphs sandwiched between a story about parking meter rates and an advertisement for Thanksgiving turkeys. Eleanor Hoffman, 73, a retired librarian who had lived at 1650 Wisconsin Avenue for 6 years, had noticed a strange chemical smell around 2:15 a.m. on November 14th and called both the gas company and police. Officers responding to the scene found what appeared to be a counterfeiting operation in the apartment directly below hers. Apartment 3B, leased to a woman named Margaret Weiss, who had not been seen since the incident. What the Post didn't report, what nobody outside a very small circle knew, was that Margaret Weiss didn't exist. Neither did the gas leak. And the printing operation Detective Cordderero had stumbled upon wasn't producing counterfeit currency. It was printing classified CIA operational cables. In November 1978, the Cold War had settled into what historians would later call its mature phase. Détente, the Nixon-era policy of reduced tensions with the Soviet Union, was dying a slow death under President Jimmy Carter, who had made human rights the centerpiece of his foreign policy. The Soviets had recently invaded Afghanistan, though that wouldn't become public knowledge for another 13 months. In Washington, the intelligence community was still reeling from the Church Committee investigations of 1975 to 76, which had exposed decades of CIA domestic surveillance, assassination plots, and illegal operations. The agency was smaller, more cautious, more bureaucratic. Or so everyone believed. At the Soviet Embassy on Wisconsin Avenue, just 6 blocks from 1650 Wisconsin Avenue NW, KGB resident Dmitry Yakushkin ran a staff of 47 intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. Yakushkin, 51, a veteran of the KGB's first chief directorate who had previously served in Paris and London, was considered one of Moscow's most effective station chiefs in the West. His networks in Washington were legendary within the center, the KGB's Moscow headquarters. According to intercepted communications that the NSA had partially decoded, Yakushkin's agents had penetrated the State Department, the Commerce Department, and at least 2 major defense contractors. What the CIA didn't know, what nobody in American intelligence knew until that night, was that Yakushkin had also penetrated the agency itself. The operation was called Amberstream, though that code name wouldn't surface in declassified documents until 2004. It had begun in 1961, in the chaotic early days of the Kennedy administration, when a young CIA communications clerk named Robert Vega had walked into the Soviet consulate in Mexico City and offered his services to the KGB. Vega, 26 at the time, had been passed over for promotion 3 times, despite what he considered superior performance. He was angry, resentful, and, most importantly, he had access to the agency's cable routing system, the network through which classified communications flowed between CIA headquarters in Langley and field stations around the world. The KGB didn't want Vega to steal documents. That was crude 19th century tradecraft. Instead, they wanted something far more valuable: real-time access to CIA communications. Over a period of 6 months, working with a KGB technical team, Vega installed a series of electronic intercepts in the cable routing system. Small devices, each about the size of a pack of cigarettes, that could copy and transmit message traffic to a receiver located outside Langley. The technology was crude by later standards, but in 1961 it was sophisticated enough. The devices transmitted on a high-frequency band that required special receiving equipment to detect. For 17 years, every cable sent from or received by CIA headquarters had been simultaneously transmitted to a listening post operated by the KGB. The volume of intelligence was staggering, hundreds of messages per day, ranging from routine administrative traffic to the highest level operational communications. The KGB's Washington station couldn't process it all in real time, so they used a relay system. The intercepts were transmitted to the apartment at 1650 Wisconsin Avenue, where they were recorded, printed, sorted, and then passed to a courier who made weekly trips to the Soviet Embassy's secure communications center. The apartment was a technical marvel, a miniature signals intelligence facility hidden in plain sight in an upper-middle-class Washington neighborhood. In what should have been a bedroom, the KGB had installed a Siemens receiving station, a high-speed printer modified to handle encrypted traffic, and a storage system for magnetic tapes. The equipment ran 24 hours a day, cooled by a ventilation system that vented through the building's existing ductwork. The hum that Cordderero had heard was the printer, which operated continuously, producing a paper record of every intercepted cable. Margaret Weiss, real name Klavdia Petrova, a KGB technical officer who had entered the United States in 1972 with expertly forged documents, managed the operation. She collected the printed cables, photographed them using a microfilm camera, destroyed the originals, and passed the film to her handler every Thursday evening during what appeared to be a routine shopping trip to Safeway on MacArthur Boulevard. Petrova, 39, spoke perfect English with a slight Chicago accent she'd learned at the KGB's training facility in Minsk. Her cover story was simple and boring. Divorced legal secretary, no children, kept to herself. Neighbors described her as quiet, pleasant, forgettable. The chemical smell that Eleanor Hoffman had noticed wasn't from a gas leak. It was from the printer's toner, which used a selenium-based compound that, when the ventilation system partially failed, began to drift upward through the building's air ducts. The failure was minor, a fan motor running 20 degrees hotter than normal, nothing catastrophic, but enough to push the smell into Mrs. Hoffman's apartment. She had done exactly what any concerned citizen would do. She called for help. What happened next was a cascade of accidents, mistakes, and split-second decisions that would unravel the most successful Soviet intelligence operation in the Western Hemisphere. When Cordderero pushed open the door to the bedroom-turned-operations center, the first thing he saw was the printer. It sat on a sturdy wooden table, a large gray machine about the size of a small refrigerator, feeding continuous form paper through its mechanism with mechanical precision. The paper emerged with lines of text. Not in English, Cordderero noted immediately, but in groups of 5-letter blocks that his brain recognized as code, even though he had no intelligence training. XPMQR, TKLVN, ZWABC, GHSTU. The paper piled up in a wire basket, sheet after sheet, the machine indifferent to the presence of an intruder. To the left of the printer stood the receiving station, a collection of electronic equipment that Cordderero didn't recognize but knew was wrong. Wrong for a residential apartment. Wrong for any civilian purpose he could imagine. Green LED displays showed numbers that changed every few seconds. Tape reels turned slowly behind a plexiglass panel. The red light he'd seen from the hallway came from a status indicator that pulsed with each incoming transmission. The smell was overwhelming in here, almost choking. Cordderero pulled his handkerchief from his pocket and covered his nose and mouth. The room was warm, much warmer than the rest of the apartment, and he could hear the labored sound of a ventilation fan somewhere above the ceiling tiles. On a smaller table against the far wall, Cordderero saw what appeared to be a camera setup. Lights, a copy stand, stacks of what looked like film canisters. Next to it, a cardboard box filled with shredded paper. The floor was spotless, recently vacuumed, and the windows were covered with blackout curtains that didn't quite reach the sill. Corddero's training told him to back out, secure the scene, call for backup. But his curiosity, the same quality that had made him a good forward observer in Vietnam, made him step closer to the printer. He pulled one of the sheets from the basket, careful not to touch anything else. The paper was warm, freshly printed. At the top of the page, a timestamp, 14 OV78 0243Z. Below that, the coded text in neat, evenly spaced lines. He had no idea what he was looking at, but he knew it was important. "Detective?" Carlos Reyes called from the hallway. His voice nervous. "You find anything?" "Yeah," Cordderero said, still staring at the printer. "Call it in. Tell them I need a supervisor and—" He paused, trying to think of what exactly he needed. "Tell them I need someone from the FBI." He didn't know why he said FBI instead of the gas company or the fire department. Instinct, maybe. Or the creeping realization that whatever this was, it was way above a gas leak. Reyes disappeared, and Cordderero heard his footsteps hurrying down the hallway. Alone in the room with the machinery, Cordderero noticed something else. A small leather notebook sitting next to the camera equipment. He knew he shouldn't touch it, knew he was potentially contaminating a crime scene, but he picked it up anyway. Inside, handwritten notes in English. A woman's handwriting, neat and precise. Thursday, Novi 9. So 47 items. Exposure set 160. Friday, no viewers 10. 53 items. New toner cartridge installed. Saturday, Novi 11. 29 items. Ventilation check needed. The notebook felt heavy in his hand, weighted with implications he was only beginning to understand. This wasn't a counterfeit operation. This wasn't even a regular criminal enterprise. This was something else, something organized and professional, and, the word came to him slowly, foreign. He put the notebook back exactly where he'd found it and stepped out of the room, leaving the door open. In the living room, everything still looked normal, domestic, unthreatening. The photograph on the wall showed the couple still smiling their stiff smiles. On the coffee table, he noticed a small appointment book, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. He opened it. November 14th was blank. November 15th, tomorrow, had a single notation. 4:30 p.m., Safeway. The printer continued its mechanical song in the other room, printing secrets into the early morning darkness, unaware that after 17 years of perfect operation, its usefulness had just ended. FBI Special Agent Daniel Kovacs arrived at 1650 Wisconsin Avenue at 3:52 a.m., driving a dark blue Ford LTD that he parked half on the sidewalk in his hurry. Kovacs, 44, was assigned to the Washington Field Office's Foreign Counterintelligence Division, a unit that spent most of its time monitoring Soviet diplomats and investigating leads that usually went nowhere. He had been home asleep when the duty officer called. The MPD had something unusual that might require bureau attention. Kovacs had grabbed his coat and badge and left his wife sleeping, expecting another false alarm, another paranoid tip that would turn out to be nothing. When Detective Cordderero showed him the printer room, Kovacs stood silent for 30 seconds, just staring, his mind racing through the implications. "Nobody touches anything else," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Nobody comes in or out of this apartment without my authorization. I need to make a phone call." The phone call went to FBI headquarters, to the night duty officer for the Counterintelligence Division, who then called the Deputy Director for Intelligence, who then called CIA's Deputy Director of Operations. By 4:30 a.m., a joint task force was forming. By 5 a.m., a CIA technical team was en route from Langley. By 6 a.m., the entire block around 1650 Wisconsin Avenue was under discreet surveillance. And Claudia Petrova, Margaret Weiss to her neighbors, was gone. She had left sometime between 2:30 a.m. and 2:47 a.m., apparently alerted by some mechanism the investigators would never fully understand. Perhaps a silent alarm connected to the apartment door. Perhaps a neighbor she'd recruited as a lookout. Perhaps just the instinct that comes from years of living a double life, the animal sense that tells you when something has changed, when danger is close. Her car, a beige 1975 Honda Civic, was gone from its parking spot in the building's rear lot. Her toothbrush was gone from the bathroom. The closet showed empty hangers where clothes had hung hours before, but she'd left the equipment, left the printer still running, still spooling out intercepted cables, left the receiving station still pulling signals from the air, left the notebook with its careful notations. She'd had time to grab some essentials and run, but not enough time for a proper sanitization. That was the first mistake, the one that would unravel everything. The CIA technical team arrived at 6:23 a.m., 4 men in civilian clothes carrying metal cases full of equipment. They were led by a senior signals intelligence officer named Warren Belmont, a thin, intense man in his 50s who had spent the past 20 years hunting Soviet electronic surveillance operations. Belmont examined the receiving station with the careful attention of a jeweler examining a diamond. "Jesus Christ," he said after 10 minutes. "This is receiving from inside Langley." The room went silent. Kovacs, who had been taking notes, stopped writing. Cordderero, who had been sent home hours ago but refused to leave, felt his stomach drop. The implications were enormous, almost incomprehensible. "You're sure?" Kovac asked. Belmont pointed to one of the displays on the receiving station. "See this frequency? That's our cable routing system. And this encryption format, that's current. As in, we're using this right now." He turned to look at Kovac, his face pale. "Someone at Langley is transmitting our traffic directly to this apartment. Has been for..." He checked the equipment's hour meter. "Years. Maybe decades." The second team arrived 90 minutes later, a smaller group from CIA's Office of Security, the division responsible for internal investigations. They were led by James Caldwell, the Assistant Deputy Director for Security, a careful, methodical man who understood that his career would be defined by what happened next. If the Soviets had penetrated CIA communications, if they had access to operational cables, then virtually every operation the agency had run in the past decade, maybe longer, was compromised. Caldwell's first order was simple: pull the plug, shut down the cable routing system, all of it, right now. At Langley, technicians began the emergency shutdown of the entire communications network at 8:47 a.m. For the first time in CIA's history, headquarters went dark, unable to send or receive traffic. Field stations around the world found themselves cut off, their messages disappearing into an electronic void. In Moscow, in Paris, in Beirut, CIA officers suddenly stopped receiving instructions, support, guidance. The agency had been blinded by its own security breach. In the apartment, the printer ran for another 7 minutes after the shutdown began, clearing its buffer, printing the last messages that had been queued. Then it fell silent, the sudden absence of mechanical noise making the room feel empty and strange. Belmont's team spent the rest of the day tracing the signal back to its source. The trail led to Langley, to a specific equipment room in the basement of the original headquarters building, to a series of intercept devices installed in the cable routing hardware. The devices were sophisticated, nearly impossible to detect without knowing exactly what to look for. They had been installed with expert knowledge of CIA's communications architecture. By evening, the investigation had a clear focus: find Robert Vega, the communications clerk who had disappeared in 1978 during what his supervisors had assumed was a personal crisis. Find him and maybe, just maybe, determine how much damage had been done. But Robert Vega was dead. He had died in a car accident outside Mexico City in 1967, shortly after his last payment from the KGB. The accident had been ruled accidental at the time. Drunk driver, Vega's car forced off a mountain road, but now investigators wondered. Had the KGB eliminated him once his usefulness ended? Or had it really been an accident? A random tragedy that left the Soviet operation running on autopilot for 11 more years? The answer, buried in KGB files that wouldn't be opened until after the Soviet Union's collapse, was simpler and more chilling. Vega had been eliminated because he'd asked for too much money. The KGB had decided he was becoming a liability, too expensive, too risky. They killed him and left his intercept devices in place, operating unmanned, a ghost in the machine that kept stealing secrets long after its creator was gone. Thursday, November 16th, 1978. 4:37 p.m. Safeway Supermarket, 5225 MacArthur Boulevard, Chitzurch, Washington, D.C. FBI Special Agent Sarah Mendez sat in the front seat of a rented Chevrolet Impala in the supermarket parking lot, watching the entrance through a telephoto lens. She had been there since 3 o'clock p.m., waiting for someone who probably wouldn't show. The operation was a long shot. If Margaret Weiss Klavdia Petrova had any sense, she was already out of the country, probably in Mexico or Canada, working her way back to Moscow. But Mendez had learned that spycraft often came down to routine, to patterns so deeply ingrained that even panic couldn't completely override them. The appointment book had said 4:30 p.m., Safeway. Today was Thursday. Petrova had kept that appointment every Thursday for 6 years, according to surveillance footage that FBI was now frantically reviewing. Every Thursday, at 4:30 p.m., she would arrive at this Safeway, shop for groceries, and at some point during her visit, make contact with her handler. The method was textbook. A brush pass in the cereal aisle, a dead drop behind the dumpsters, a brief conversation near the shopping carts. The FBI didn't know exactly how they made contact, but they knew it happened. At 4:33 p.m., a beige Honda Civic turned into the parking lot. Mendez felt her pulse quicken. She lifted her radio. All units, possible target vehicle entering from north entrance. Beige Honda Civic, license plate. She squinted through the lens. Victor, Mary, 7321. The car parked 3 rows from the entrance. Mendez watched as a woman got out. Blonde, medium height, wearing a dark coat and carrying a large purse. Even at this distance, even through the camera, Mendez could see the tension in the woman's movements. This wasn't normal shopping behavior. This was someone on edge. Someone who knew the world had changed, but couldn't quite abandon the old patterns. "That's her," Mendez said into the radio. "All units hold position. Let her enter the store." Petrova walked toward the Safeway entrance with mechanical precision, her training overriding her fear. She had been a professional intelligence officer for 18 years, had operated in hostile territory, had been taught that discipline and routine were survival tools. The plan, drilled into her during months of training in Moscow, was simple. If compromise occurs, attempt one final contact with your handler to alert the network, then exfiltrate through the established emergency route. She was attempting the final contact. Inside the store, 6 FBI agents were positioned as shoppers, employees, delivery personnel. They watched as Petrova entered, grabbed a shopping cart, and moved toward the produce section. Her movements were too quick, too purposeful. Normal shoppers wandered, compared prices, picked up items and put them back. Petrova was going through the motions, but her mind was elsewhere. She selected apples without looking at them, grabbed a head of lettuce that had brown spots, put a box of cereal in her cart. Cornflakes. Always cornflakes. The same brand every week because it made the dead drop location predictable. In the cereal aisle, she paused, pretended to compare prices. Her hand moved to the back of the shelf, feeling for the small magnetic container that would be attached to the metal support structure. The container, no bigger than a matchbox, would hold microfilm from her handler's previous drop, plus instructions for emergency exfiltration if needed. Her fingers found nothing. The container was gone. Mendez, watching from outside through a team member's hidden camera, saw Petrova's shoulders stiffen. The woman stood frozen for 3 seconds, an eternity in operational terms, then slowly withdrew her hand. "She knows," Mendez said into her radio. "All units be ready." But Petrova didn't run. Instead, she did something that stunned the surveillance team. She continued shopping, moved to the dairy section, selected milk and butter, went to the checkout line, paid for her groceries with cash, walked out of the store carrying 2 paper bags, her face a perfect mask of suburban normalcy. It was only when she reached her car that she deviated from the script. Instead of loading the groceries into her trunk, she set them on the ground next to the Honda and walked away, hands in her pockets, heading toward MacArthur Boulevard. "Subject is mobile on foot," Mendez reported, "heading east on MacArthur. All units maintain visual, but do not approach." Petrova walked for 2 blocks, then turned into a residential neighborhood. The FBI team followed at a careful distance, using multiple vehicles and rotating positions to avoid detection. But Petrova wasn't watching for surveillance anymore. She had moved beyond that, into some final phase of her training that Mendez didn't understand. 3 blocks later, Petrova turned into the driveway of a small house with a "for sale" sign in the front yard. The house was empty, had been on the market for 6 months. She walked to the side door, produced a key from her pocket, and went inside. "All units hold position," Mendez ordered. "Surround the house but maintain distance. She may be armed." For 15 minutes, nothing happened. The house sat silent in the late afternoon light, its windows dark. FBI agents took positions around the perimeter, weapons drawn but concealed. Mendez called for SWAT backup and a hostage negotiator, though she doubted they'd need either. At 5:02 p.m., a gunshot echoed from inside the house. The FBI team stormed the building, moving with practiced efficiency. They found Klavdia Petrova in the upstairs bedroom, lying on the floor with a Makarov pistol beside her right hand. She had placed the barrel in her mouth and fired once. Death had been instantaneous. On the floor next to her body, arranged with deliberate care, was a sealed envelope addressed to The Washington Post. Inside, FBI agents would find a handwritten letter detailing her 17 years as a KGB officer in the United States, along with a list of dead drop locations, safe houses, and contact protocols. It was a final act of defiance. If she couldn't escape, she would at least control the narrative, ensure that her service was acknowledged, reveal enough information to cause maximum embarrassment to American intelligence. But the letter also contained something else, something Petrova had included, almost as an afterthought. The name of her handler, the KGB officer she had been trying to contact at the Safeway. His name was Viktor Karpov, first secretary at the Soviet embassy, and he had been running agent networks in Washington for 12 years. The arrest came 3 days later, during the carefully orchestrated chaos of a diplomatic reception. Viktor Karpov, 47, was taken into custody by FBI agents as he left a dinner at the French embassy. His diplomatic immunity immediately revoked by a State Department that had been briefed on the severity of the breach. Karpov, a professional to the end, said nothing during his arrest, nothing during his transfer to FBI custody, nothing during the first 12 hours of interrogation. But he didn't need to talk. The evidence from Petrova's apartment, combined with surveillance footage that FBI had been collecting for years without quite understanding its significance, painted a clear picture. Karpov had been her handler, had run the Amberstream operation after Vega's death, had overseen a network that extended far beyond just the CIA cable intercepts. In Petrova's apartment, investigators found a complete archive of her microfilm work, thousands of frames of photographed documents dating back 6 years, stored in a fireproof safe that had been built into the bedroom closet. She hadn't destroyed them, hadn't even tried. Perhaps she thought she'd have time. Perhaps she couldn't bring herself to eliminate the evidence of her life's work. The microfilm revealed an intelligence catastrophe of staggering proportions. Every significant CIA operation from 1961 to 1978 had been compromised. The Bay of Pigs invasion. The Soviets had known the exact landing sites and timing. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Moscow had read Kennedy's private communications to his advisors. CIA operations in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all penetrated, all exposed. The agency's efforts to recruit Soviet defectors, to run networks inside the Eastern Bloc, to monitor Soviet military developments, all of it, flowing to Moscow in real time. But the damage went deeper than blown operations. The cable intercepts had given the KGB insight into CIA's entire organizational structure, its methods, its priorities, its weaknesses. Moscow had essentially had a window into the mind of American intelligence for 17 years. The strategic advantage was incalculable. Warren Belmont, the signals intelligence officer who had first identified the receiving equipment, spent 3 weeks examining the intercept devices at Langley. His final report, classified top secret and distributed to only 9 people, concluded that the penetration had been nearly perfect in its execution and devastating in its impact. The devices had been designed to be undetectable, requiring no maintenance, drawing power from the cable routing system itself. They had been installed with expert knowledge of CIA's communications infrastructure, suggesting that Vega had received detailed technical training from the KGB. The question that haunted investigators was simple. Why hadn't anyone noticed? How had thousands of compromised operations, hundreds of captured agents, dozens of failed recruitments not triggered some alarm? The answer, when it finally emerged from the post-mortem analysis, was both simple and damning. People had noticed. CIA officers had filed reports questioning why operations consistently failed, why assets disappeared, why the Soviets always seemed one step ahead. But those reports had been dismissed as paranoia, as the normal friction of intelligence work, as bad luck. The agency's culture, still shaped by Cold War confidence and institutional arrogance, had refused to believe that it could be penetrated so completely. James Caldwell, the security officer who had overseen the initial investigation, resigned in January 1979. His resignation letter, declassified in 2007, was blunt. "We failed to protect our own operations because we failed to believe that we could fail. This institutional blindness is perhaps more dangerous than any spy." The cable routing system was completely rebuilt, a process that took 9 months and cost $83 million. Every communications device at Langley was replaced. Every protocol was rewritten. The agency created a new counterintelligence division specifically to monitor internal security, giving it unprecedented authority to investigate officers, examine operations, and question decisions. But the rebuilding was tactical. The strategic damage, the 17 years of compromised operations, the agents captured or killed, the networks rolled up, couldn't be fixed. Historians would later estimate that Amberstream had cost the lives of at least 34 CIA assets, had exposed more than 200 operations, and had given the Soviet Union strategic intelligence advantages that persisted well into the 1980s. In Moscow, the KGB celebrated quietly. Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, who would later become General Secretary of the Communist Party, sent a classified memo to the Politburo detailing the success of Amberstream. The operation, he wrote, had provided the Soviet Union with unprecedented insight into the mind and methods of our primary adversary. The memo, discovered in KGB archives after the Soviet collapse, noted that the operation had ended not through Soviet error, but through technical failure beyond our control, the ventilation malfunction that had sent chemical fumes into Eleanor Hoffman's apartment. Random chance. A fan motor running a few degrees too hot. The smell of printer toner drifting through an air duct. A concerned elderly woman making a phone call. That's how the largest intelligence coup of the Cold War came to an end. The revelation became public in stages, each disclosure carefully managed to minimize political damage. The initial news stories, appearing in March 1979, reported only that a Soviet intelligence operation had been discovered in Washington. The involvement of CIA communications wasn't mentioned. The 17-year timeline wasn't disclosed. Margaret Weiss, Klavdia Petrova, was described as a suspected agent whose identity was still being investigated. The truth emerged slowly, grudgingly, through congressional testimony and investigative journalism. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence held closed hearings in May 1979, calling CIA Director Stansfield Turner to explain how such a massive penetration could have occurred. Turner's testimony, partially declassified in 1994, was defensive and sometimes contradictory. He acknowledged that serious failures had occurred, but insisted that many of the details remained classified for national security reasons. Senator Frank Church, who had led the earlier investigations into CIA domestic surveillance, was blunt in his response. The American people have a right to know when their intelligence service has been compromised for nearly 2 decades. This is not a matter of protecting sources and methods. This is a matter of accountability. The full story began to emerge in 1983, when a former CIA officer named Edward Thompson published a book titled Amberstream: How the Soviets Read Our Mail. Thompson, who had resigned from the agency in 1980, provided detailed accounts of the investigation, the technology, and the aftermath. The book was controversial. The CIA attempted to block its publication on national security grounds, but courts ruled that most of Thompson's information was already in the public domain or could be reasonably deduced from declassified materials. Thompson's book revealed something that investigators had kept quiet. Robert Vega, the communications clerk who had installed the intercept devices, had tried to surrender to the FBI in 1965. He had walked into the FBI's Mexico City office and attempted to confess, but the duty agent had dismissed him as a crank, a drunk American expatriate telling spy stories. Vega had left the FBI office and returned to his apartment, where he apparently abandoned any hope of redemption. 2 years later, he was dead. The FBI agent who had dismissed Vega's confession, a man named Gerald Phillips, who had since retired, gave a single interview to the New York Times in 1984. He seemed unstable, Phillips said. He was rambling, talking about electronic devices and secret transmitters. I thought he was mentally ill or making it up for attention. I never imagined. He didn't finish the sentence. The intelligence community's internal response was dramatic. CIA created the Counterintelligence Center in 1980, a dedicated unit focused on preventing internal penetrations. The FBI established new protocols for vetting sources who claimed to have information about espionage. The National Security Agency, which had failed to detect the illegal transmissions from Langley, overhauled its domestic monitoring programs. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The assumption that American intelligence agencies were essentially impenetrable, that Soviet spies could never achieve the kind of success that Western intelligence had achieved against the Eastern Bloc, was shattered. A new paranoia took hold, healthy in some ways, toxic in others. Officers were investigated, careers were derailed, trust eroded. Eleanor Hoffman, the retired librarian whose complaint about a smell had triggered the investigation, was interviewed once by the FBI and then largely forgotten by history. She continued living in her apartment at 1650 Wisconsin Avenue until 1983, when she moved to a retirement community in Florida. In a brief interview with a local newspaper in 1985, asked if she understood the significance of what she'd discovered, she said simply, "I just didn't want the building to explode." She died in 1992, age 87. Her obituary making no mention of her role in exposing the largest Soviet intelligence operation on American soil. Viktor Karpov, the KGB handler, was exchanged for an American officer captured in East Berlin he returned to Moscow, where he worked in a training role for the KGB's first chief directorate. After the Soviet collapse, he gave several interviews to Russian newspapers, carefully avoiding any direct confirmation of his role in Amberstream, but hinting at his involvement. "We had our successes," he said in 1997. "The Americans were not as invincible as they believed." Karpov died in 2003, his funeral attended by former KGB officers who praised his service to the Soviet Union. No American intelligence officials commented on his death. The intercept devices themselves were destroyed after the investigation concluded, on orders from CIA Director Turner. Warren Belmont, the signals intelligence officer who had analyzed them, argued for preserving at least one device for training purposes, but his recommendation was overruled. The technology, even inactive, was considered too dangerous to keep. Only photographs remain, stored in classified archives at CIA headquarters. The devices are surprisingly small in the photographs. Unremarkable black boxes, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes. They look harmless, almost quaint by modern standards. But for 17 years, they were the most productive intelligence collectors in the history of the Cold War. The apartment at 1650 Wisconsin Avenue was cleaned out in December 1978, its equipment removed by CIA technicians who left no trace of what had been there. The bedroom that had housed the printing operation was repainted, the walls repaired where cables had been run, the floor replaced where equipment had stood. By January 1979, it looked like any other bedroom in any other apartment in Washington. The apartment was rented to a young lawyer in March 1979. He lived there for 2 years, completely unaware of its history. In 1981, the building was sold and converted to condominiums. The apartment changed hands several times over the decades, its owners never knowing that they slept in a room where thousands of classified documents had been printed, where the secrets of an entire intelligence agency had flowed through electronic equipment hidden in plain sight. In 2004, when the first detailed accounts of Amberstream were declassified, a historical marker was briefly considered for the building. The proposal was quietly dropped after objections from CIA and FBI, who argued that marking the location would serve no purpose except to embarrass the intelligence community. The building stands today, unremarkable and anonymous. Its connection to one of the Cold War's greatest intelligence failures, known only to historians and former officers. The gas company, responding to Mrs. Hoffman's original complaint, sent a technician to inspect the building's natural gas lines in November 1978. He found no leak, filed a report indicating customer error or alternate source of odor, and closed the case. The report, stored in the Washington Gas Company's archives, notes that the appointment was scheduled for November 15th. But the customer canceled because the smell had gone away. In the National Security Archive at George Washington University, researchers can access declassified documents related to the Amberstream investigation. The files are incomplete. Many documents remain classified 47 years later, but they provide a glimpse into the panic and recrimination that followed the discovery. Memos show CIA officers blaming FBI for not taking Vega's 1965 confessions seriously. FBI documents show agents blaming CIA for inadequate security procedures. State Department cables show diplomats worrying about how to explain the breach to allied governments. One document stands out: a handwritten note from Stansfield Turner to President Carter, dated November 20th, 1978. Mr. President, it begins, the damage is worse than we initially believed. We must assume that virtually all operations from 1961 to present have been compromised. The strategic implications are still being assessed, but I must be candid. This is the most serious intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor. Carter's response, written in the margin of the memo, consisted of 3 words: how do we recover? The answer took years. Some would argue the CIA never fully recovered, that the institutional trauma of Amberstream permanently altered the agency's culture, made it more cautious, more bureaucratic, more focused on protecting itself than on taking risks. Others would argue that the shock was necessary, that the old CIA's arrogance had made it vulnerable, and that only a catastrophic failure could force meaningful reform. Both perspectives may be true. In the basement of CIA headquarters at Langley, in a secure room that requires special clearance to access, there is a small display case. Inside the case sits a single object: a notebook with a brown leather cover, slightly worn at the edges. The notebook is open to a page dated November 13th, 1978. The handwriting is neat, feminine, precise. Monday, Novi 13, 42 items, good reception quality. Ventilation fan motor temperature elevated. Schedule maintenance check. It was the last entry Claudia Petrova ever made. Written approximately 24 hours before Detective Michael Cordderero smelled something wrong and walked into an apartment that would change the history of Cold War intelligence. The notebook is not labeled. No plaque explains its significance. It simply sits there, a reminder to the officers who visit this room that failure can come from anywhere. From a technical malfunction, from a concerned citizen, from a smell drifting through an air duct on a cold November night. Sometimes, late at night, when the building is nearly empty, senior officers will come to this room and stand before the case, studying the handwriting, thinking about the 17 years of stolen secrets, the 34 dead assets, the hundreds of blown operations. They think about Robert Vega, who tried to confess and was turned away. They think about Viktor Karpov, celebrating in Moscow. They think about Eleanor Hoffman, smelling something wrong and making a phone call. Most of all, they think about the hubris that allowed it to happen. The assumption that American intelligence was too sophisticated, too careful, too smart to be penetrated so completely. That hubris, more than any spy or device, was the real vulnerability. The notebook sits in its case, silent and accusatory, a fragment of history preserved as a warning. On the wall above it, a small brass plate carries a quote from CIA's first director, Allen Dulles. The price of security is eternal vigilance. Somewhere in Moscow, in the archives of the SVR, the successor to the KGB, there is a corresponding display. It contains a small black box, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, housed in plexiglass. The device no longer works. Its internal circuits were fried when CIA technicians discovered it in 1978. But it represents something that Russian intelligence officers still take pride in. Proof that even the most powerful intelligence agency in the world could be beaten. Not through force or coercion, but through patience, planning, and the exploitation of human weakness. The two displays, facing each other across the Cold War's dividing line, tell the same story in different languages. Both serve as reminders. Both are artifacts of a war fought in shadows, where victory and defeat were measured in stolen documents and broken codes, and the smell of printer toner drifting through an air duct on a cold November night. The Cold War ended in 1991. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and the ideological struggle that had defined half a century finally exhausted itself. But the lessons of Amberstream persist, studied by intelligence officers and historians, debated by scholars and policymakers. How do you protect secrets in a world where technology enables surveillance on an unprecedented scale? How do you balance security with operational effectiveness? How do you maintain the institutional humility necessary to recognize when you're being defeated? These questions remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. What is certain is that somewhere, in some apartment or office or basement, in some city around the world, another operation is running. Another spy is collecting secrets. Another intercept device is transmitting data to a hostile intelligence service. The methods have changed. The technology is digital now. The communications are encrypted. The tradecraft has evolved. But the fundamental dynamic remains the same. And somewhere, someone is smelling something wrong, noticing something that doesn't quite fit, making a phone call that will change history. The question is whether anyone will listen.